In 1957, on a factory floor in Dearborn, Michigan, workers built 15 cars in a single day and then never built them again, not because they failed, not because nobody wanted them, but because a governing body banned them before a single one ever crossed a finish line. That is not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is that those 15 cars share a secret engine part with a dying luxury brand, a desperate family sedan maker, and a station wagon that could out-accelerate a Corvette. 4 completely different companies, 4 completely different reasons, 1 identical supercharger, and a 5-year window in American history that almost nobody remembers today. By the time this video ends, you will understand why 1954 to 1958 was the strangest, most desperate, and most brilliant era Detroit ever produced, and you will know exactly which car was crowned the fastest, the rarest, and the last of its kind. Stay until the end, because the final car on this list is the very last vehicle to ever wear one of the most legendary names in American automotive history, and its story will genuinely give you chills. Let's start at number 7. Number 7 takes us back to 1954, to a company most people today have never even heard of. Kaiser Frazer was born right after World War II, riding a tidal wave of pent-up demand. Soldiers were coming home, factories were retooling from tanks to sedans, and for one brief shining moment, Kaiser genuinely competed with the giants of Detroit. But by the early 50s, the ground shifted under their feet. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler were rolling out brand new overhead valve V8 engines, lighter, more powerful, and hungry for the future. Kaiser was still stuck with a tired 226 cubic inch inline-six, an engine whose roots traced all the way back to a company called Continental, producing a modest 118 horsepower. In a market that had suddenly decided horsepower was the only language that mattered, 118 horsepower was the wrong answer. And everyone in the industry knew it. Here's the part that makes this story painful. Kaiser did not have the money to build a new V8. Not a little short on cash. Genuinely, dangerously short. So instead of quietly surrendering, instead of accepting they were about to be erased from the market, Kaiser did something almost nobody expected. They went looking for a man named Robert Paxton McCulloch, a Stanford-trained engineer who had spent since the late 1930s quietly perfecting something most manufacturers had ignored. A compact centrifugal supercharger. His creation, called the V57, was elegantly simple. Belt-driven, spooling up boost above 3,000 revolutions per minute. Small enough and reliable enough to bolt directly onto an existing production engine without redesigning the entire car. Kaiser fitted it to their old, worn-out 6-cylinder, dialed the boost down to a cautious 4 pounds per square inch for reliability, and watched horsepower jump from 118 to 140. Now, on paper, that sounds unimpressive next to the roaring V8s flooding showrooms that year. But here's the twist nobody expected. Kaiser was never trying to win a horsepower war they had already lost. They were trying to survive one more year, just one more year, and for a company on the edge of bankruptcy, that supercharger was not a performance upgrade, it was oxygen. Kaiser marketed the 1954 Manhattan with the slogan 2 engines in 1, blending economy with energy, and it worked well enough that 0 to 60 times dropped from a sluggish 17.5 seconds down to around 15 with the manual transmission. Every single engine that left the factory was inspected component by component, making these arguably the most carefully built engines Kaiser ever produced. Several thousand supercharged Manhattans rolled off the line before Kaiser shut down its American passenger car operations entirely in 1955. The supercharger did not save the company. Nothing could have saved the company at that point, but it earned Kaiser something no other American brand could claim. In 1954, the title of the very first post-war American production car to offer a factory-installed supercharger as standard equipment, a tiny footnote in automotive history. But one this dying company absolutely earned, and that footnote is exactly where this story truly begins. Because what Kaiser started out of desperation was about to spread to 3 more brands, each one more desperate than the last. Number 6 takes us to 1957, and to a name that once meant everything in America, Packard. Before the war, if you drove a Packard, people on the street knew exactly who you were. It stood shoulder to shoulder with Cadillac, with Lincoln, and was regularly mentioned in the same breath as Rolls-Royce when people talked about the finest automobiles on earth. Their advertising slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," is still remembered as one of the greatest lines in the history of American car marketing. But by the mid-1950s, everything had collapsed. Studebaker Packard Corporation was drowning in debt, and production had been consolidated into the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana. Here is the gut punch. Packard was no longer designing its own cars. Not partially, not mostly, completely. The new 1957 Packard was essentially a Studebaker president wearing a restyled face, an extra layer of chrome, and a Packard badge bolted on before being shipped straight to the showroom floor. Critics at the time were merciless. They nicknamed it the Packard Baker, and honestly, nobody could argue the point. But here's where the story takes a turn. Nobody expects. Every single one of the 4,809 Packard Clippers built in 1957 came with a Studebaker 289 cubic inch V8, fitted with a factory McCulloch VS57 Supercharger, producing 275 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute. That was not an option you could add. It was not a premium trim level. It was the only engine offered. If you bought a 1957 Packard Clipper, you were driving a supercharged V8, whether you asked for it or not. And here is the detail almost nobody realizes. The detail that turns this footnote into something genuinely remarkable. Out of those 4,809 cars, 869 of them were the country sedan station wagon, a 7-passenger family hauler dripping in chrome, with a cargo area big enough for a weekend's worth of luggage, and 275 supercharged horsepower waiting under the hood. Think about that for a second. In 1957, while families were loading golf clubs and suitcases into the back of a boxy station wagon, they were sitting on top of one of the fastest station wagons on American roads, and almost none of them ever knew it. Automotive historian Richard Langworth later summed it up perfectly when he wrote that while these cars were not truly Packards in spirit, they were nonetheless very good Studebakers. That might be the most honest compliment a Packard Baker was ever going to receive. A brand built on aristocratic prestige, reduced to borrowing another company's platform, and yet somehow producing one of the sleeper performance bargains of the entire decade. But the fall of Packard was only getting started, and what happened next to their sister brand is even more heartbreaking. Number 5 brings us to 1958, and to a moment where America itself was struggling. The country was in a genuine recession that year. Industry-wide car sales dropped hard, and even General Motors, the untouchable giant of Detroit, was losing tens of thousands of orders. Studebaker, already weaker than the big three for years, got hit harder than almost anyone. Budgets tightened, plants slowed to reduced capacity, and the entire future of the brand grew murkier with every passing month. In the middle of all that chaos, the 1958 Studebaker Golden Hawk kept rolling off the assembly line, still carrying the exact same supercharged 289 cubic inch V8, producing 275 horsepower. The exact same formula as the year before, unchanged in any meaningful way, still fast, still handsome, still one of the most genuinely interesting cars Studebaker had ever built. And this is where the story turns quietly tragic. Only 878 units were produced in 1958, compared to 4,356 built just one single year earlier. Read that number again. That collapse says everything you need to know about what was happening to this company. After 1958, the Golden Hawk nameplate was retired entirely, disappearing from the catalog without so much as a formal announcement. It simply vanished. What makes that genuinely painful is that the car's design, shaped by the legendary Raymond Loewy school of industrial styling, remained one of the cleanest, most beautifully proportioned shapes Studebaker ever put on the road. Looking at a 1958 Golden Hawk today, it is almost impossible to believe it came from a company that was financially collapsing in real time. The car shows absolutely no signs of desperation. None. It was built with the full confidence of a brand at the very top of its game, even though the company producing it was anything but. The 1958 market simply did not care. Consumers were scared, budgets were tight, and a beautifully engineered supercharged Studebaker was not enough to save it. But rewind just one single year, back to 1957, and you will find the version of this exact same car proving something extraordinary. Something that briefly made Studebaker look like a genuine performance powerhouse. Number 4 takes us back to 1957, to the earlier and arguably more important chapter of the same Studebaker Golden Hawk story. In 1956, the Golden Hawk had been running a borrowed Packard 352 cubic inch V8, producing 275 horsepower, and that engine made it one of the fastest cars on American roads that entire year. In real-world magazine road tests, this Studebaker actually beat the Chevrolet Corvette, the Ford Thunderbird, and the mighty Chrysler 300B in a straight line. Studebaker had every right to be proud of that achievement, right up until 1957, when the Packard engine plant closed its doors forever and everything changed overnight. Studebaker suddenly had to replace that borrowed Packard V8 with the biggest engine they actually owned themselves, a 289 cubic inch V8 that only produced 225 horsepower in its naturally aspirated form. That is exactly 50 horsepower short of the year before. In the brutal car business of the 1950s, a 50 horsepower gap was not something you could quietly paper over, especially not on a car being marketed as the brand's flagship performance model. So Studebaker made a bold decision. They bolted a McCulloch V57 Supercharger directly onto that 289, dropped the compression ratio down to 7.8 to 1 to keep detonation under control, and carefully limited boost to 5 pounds per square inch. The goal was not chasing a maximum peak power number for a magazine headline. The real goal was broadening the torque curve across the entire rev range, so the car felt strong, responsive, and alive in real everyday driving conditions, not just on a dyno chart. The result was 275 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute and 333 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 revolutions per minute, numbers that match the outgoing Packard V8 almost exactly. The automotive press at the time did not hold back their praise. At 0.95 horsepower per cubic inch, this was one of the highest output ratios of any mass-production American car built in 1957. Both Road and Track Magazine and Motor Trend placed it among the fastest cars an ordinary buyer could purchase with ordinary money. Think about what that actually means. The 1957 Golden Hawk did not just barely hold its ground after losing its original engine supplier overnight. By several technical measures, it actually came out ahead of the car it replaced. 4,356 units were built that year, and every single one of them came with that supercharger as standard equipment, at absolutely no extra cost to the buyer. That is something Studebaker never marketed aggressively enough, because underneath all the financial chaos, it was a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering that history has largely forgotten. And now, the story shifts to a completely different kind of desperation, because the next company on this list was not fighting to survive bankruptcy. They were fighting to win on a racetrack, and that obsession created one of the rarest performance options in American automotive history. Number 3 takes us into 1957 and into the world of Ford. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Ford did not just quietly build one supercharged model and call it a day. They created one of the rarest, most fascinating factory performance programs America had ever seen. And they did it almost entirely because of NASCAR. In 1957, Ford was running an ambitious supercharger program aimed squarely at conquering the racetrack. But to get that engine legally approved for competition, NASCAR required manufacturers to produce a minimum number of those cars for regular public buyers to actually purchase. Rather than limit this rare supercharged engine to just one flashy model, Ford advertised it as available across their entire lineup, including the Fairlane, a mass-market family car selling close to 800,000 units a year. Somewhere in that massive production run, buried inside ordinary family sedans, parked in ordinary driveways, sat one of the most powerful engines Ford built that entire decade. The Fairlane version, known internally as the F-Code, ran the same 312 cubic inch V8 fitted with a Paxton VR57 supercharger, producing 300 horsepower. Compression was deliberately held at 8.5 to 1, so the car could run on regular pump gasoline without needing special racing fuel. Because Ford genuinely wanted everyday buyers to be able to drive this thing without a single complication. This was, without exaggeration, the most powerful engine Ford sold in all of 1957. Quietly sitting under the hood of a family sedan that your own neighbor might have parked right next to you in a grocery store parking lot, and neither of you would have had any idea what was actually under that hood. Now here's where it gets almost unbelievable. The rarest variant in the entire F-Code Fairlane lineup was the Skyliner, the model with a fully retractable metal hardtop roof, one of the most mechanically complex features Detroit had ever attempted on a consumer car up to that point. Combine that incredibly complex retractable roof mechanism with the supercharged F-Code engine, and fewer than 20 of these cars are estimated to have ever been built in that exact configuration. Finding one intact today is considered essentially impossible. Total Fairlane production that year hit 785,886 units, and the supercharged F-Code cars were an almost invisible fraction of that number, barely even traceable in Ford's own official production records. Most car enthusiasts who know this story focus entirely on the Thunderbird version of this engine because of the more famous nameplate attached to it. But the Fairlane F-Code arguably tells the more interesting story. The story of how Ford actually deployed this rare supercharger program into the real world, hidden in plain sight inside America's best-selling family car. But the true heart of this NASCAR obsession, the car built specifically to chase a speed record, is still coming up, and its story ends in a way that will genuinely frustrate you. Number 2 brings us to the true center of this entire NASCAR obsession, the 1957 Ford Thunderbird F-Code. This story starts appropriately with NASCAR itself. In 1957, Ford desperately wanted to dominate the racing circuit with a brand new supercharged engine. But before that engine could ever be approved for competition, NASCAR required it to appear on enough production cars for ordinary members of the public to actually buy one. Robert McNamara, then the head of the entire Ford division, and a man who would later go on to become one of the most controversial figures in American government, proposed a minimum production run of just 100 units. The final mandate that came down called for 65 Ford custom two-door sedans, 20 convertibles, and 15 Thunderbirds, all fitted with this new supercharged engine. All 15 of those Thunderbirds, known to collectors today as the Phase 1D F cars, were hand-assembled at the Dearborn plant in a single day, January 25, 1957. Let that sink in for a moment. 15 cars, one single day, and never repeated again. Each one came with a 312 cubic inch V8, fitted with a McCulloch VR57 Phase 1 supercharger, a heavy-duty 3-speed manual gearbox, seat belts, which were still a rarity at the time, and a fiberglass hardtop. These cars were completely stripped down, not a single gram of unnecessary chrome anywhere, because they were built for exactly one purpose, and they absolutely delivered on that purpose. At Daytona Speed Week in 1957, a Phase 1 Thunderbird set a brand new American sports car record at 138.755 miles per hour, a full 6 miles per hour faster than the previous year's record. That result convinced Ford executives they were sitting on something genuinely special. After that initial Phase 1 batch, Ford made the F-Code available as a real purchasable production option. The street version used a Packard VR57 supercharger on that same 312 cubic inch V8, rated at 300 horsepower in everyday street trim and an aggressive 340 horsepower in full race configuration. And this was not just a supercharger bolted on and called finished. The full F-Code package included a heavy-duty radiator, high-performance cylinder heads, reinforced engine internals, and a special performance camshaft. Out of the 21,380 Thunderbirds produced in 1957, only approximately 200 were these rare F-Code cars. The original sticker price sat around $4,815. Clean surviving examples today regularly clear 6 figures at auction, and the Phase 1 cars exist in a completely different category altogether, with one selling in 2011 for an astonishing $260,000. But here is where this story turns genuinely bitter, and I need you to really sit with this next part, because it is one of the most heartbreaking twists in this entire era of American automotive history. NASCAR banned the supercharger early in 1957, before a single one of these purpose-built race cars had competed in even one official race. Not one. The Automobile Manufacturers Association then issued a blanket ban on all factory-supported racing, and Ford had absolutely no choice but to walk away entirely. The whole supercharger program was shut down before it ever got the chance to prove itself where it truly mattered. On the track, the engineering effort, the hand-built cars, the Daytona speed record, all of it became the story of something that should have happened, something these engineers poured everything into, but that never got the chance it deserved. Of the original 15 Phase 1 Thunderbirds ever built, only 8 are known to still survive today. And now, we arrive at number 1, the final chapter of this entire story, a car that represents both the fastest achievement and the saddest ending of this whole supercharged era. Number 1 is the 1958 Packard Hawk, and this is the car that closes the entire story, because it is the very last automobile to ever carry the Packard name. It is also, without question, the fastest Packard ever built. To truly understand why that fact matters so much, you have to understand who Packard used to be. Before World War II, Packard was the American luxury car that wealthy buyers genuinely dreamed about owning, standing shoulder to shoulder with Cadillac and Lincoln at the very top of the domestic market, and regularly mentioned in the same breath as Rolls-Royce whenever people discussed the finest automobiles the world had ever produced. Their slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," remains one of the most famous lines in the entire history of American automotive advertising. But by 1958, Packard was no longer Packard in anything but name. The brand was slapping its badge onto Studebakers built in South Bend and calling them their own. The 1958 Packard Hawk was built on the exact same Studebaker Golden Hawk platform we already talked about, but designer Duncan McCrae did just enough to genuinely set it apart from its Studebaker sibling. The nose was completely reskinned in fiberglass with an entirely new grille treatment. The deck lid featured a bold, sculpted spare tire impression, a styling detail that not everyone loved at the time, but that nobody could ever call timid or forgettable. Inside, the cabin was finished in full leather, with upholstery that rolled dramatically up and over the door tops, a detail directly borrowed from high-end aircraft and custom boat interiors of that exact era. The instrument panel included a tachometer alongside dedicated boost and vacuum gauges, so the driver could monitor exactly what that supercharger was doing at any given moment behind the wheel. Packard called it the most exclusive car in America in their advertising materials. And at $3,995, they honestly were not entirely wrong to say so. Under the hood sat a Studebaker 289 cubic inch V8 with a McCulloch supercharger producing 275 horsepower and 333 foot-pounds of torque. 0 to 60 in under 9 seconds. Top speed around 125 miles per hour. Numbers that place the Hawk among the genuinely quickest cars available to American buyers in all of 1958. Most of the 588 units ever produced came fitted with the Borg-Warner Flight-O-Matic automatic transmission, but around 28 of them were special ordered with the T85 3-speed manual gearbox with overdrive. Those manual cars are now by far the most sought-after Packard Hawks in the entire collector world, and when one comes to market today, it genuinely does not stay available for long. Packard ceased production entirely on July 13, 1958. Those 588 Hawks were absolutely all that remained of a 60-year-old brand that had once single-handedly defined what American luxury actually meant for multiple entire decades. The 1958 Packard Hawk was not, by any honest measure, a perfect car, borrowed body, borrowed engine, and a legendary name that was actively disappearing forever with every single unit that rolled off the line. But the people lucky enough to drive it in 1958 knew exactly what they had. Something genuinely fast, something genuinely well-made, and something that was never, ever going to be built again. So look back now at all 7 of these cars, and notice the one thing they all quietly share. Not a single one of these companies chose a supercharger because they actually wanted to. Kaiser used it because they could not afford to build a real V8. Studebaker used it because their borrowed Packard engine simply disappeared overnight. Ford used it purely to qualify for NASCAR homologation rules, and then got banned before their cars ever competed in a single race. And Packard used it because by that point in their history, there was genuinely nothing else left to build with. The entire era of the McCulloch supercharger on American production cars lasted exactly 4 model years, from 1954 to 1958, and then it was gone. NASCAR banned it. The Automobile Manufacturers Association pact killed off factory-supported racing entirely, and one by one, the desperate companies that had relied on this single piece of engineering to stay alive quietly faded away forever. What strikes me most, looking back at this whole story, is that every single one of these cars was born from failure, from budget cuts, from broken promises, and from companies fighting for their own survival. And yet somehow, all 7 of them ended up becoming some of the most fascinating, most collectible, and most genuinely fast American cars of the entire decade. Desperation, it turns out, sometimes builds better cars than confidence ever could. Now I want to hear from you directly. If you could only keep one of these 7 cars in your own garage, would you choose the 1957 Thunderbird F-Code, the race car that never got to race, or the 1958 Packard Hawk, the last car to ever carry a legendary name into history? Drop your answer in the comments below and let me know which one of these 7 forgotten machines surprised you the most, because I guarantee at least one of these stories was something you had genuinely never heard before today. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of American automotive history with me, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are dozens more forgotten stories exactly like this one, still waiting to be told, and you will not want to miss a single one of them.